Welcome to the Intentional Pause podcast. I'm Dr. Chris Sopa, but you can call me Dr. Chris. Each week, we'll explore personal growth, self-awareness, leadership, and the power of slowing down in a fast-moving world, where we create space to slow down, hear your own voice again, and make more intentional choices in work and life. Let's get started. Hello, everybody. Welcome back. So excited you decided to join us today. Today, we are talking about self-leadership. Now, I don't want that topic to scare you off if you're not a leader, because we are all leaders no matter what we do. So you'll notice a lot of the topics I talk about are leadership. You know, if we lean more towards the corporate side and I talk about leadership, you always can use elements of that in your personal life. And so the hat I want you to wear as I talk about self-leadership is that. Because yes, self-leadership is really important if you're a formal leader in an organization, because you have to be a good self-leader before you're a good formal leader. But in your personal life, you are leading yourself all of the time. And I give a few examples as I'm going to talk today about this for you to understand that. But I want you to think about leading your life, leading yourself. That's really where we're going to go today with this topic of self-leadership. Leadership, no matter where, if we're talking formal leadership, if we're talking self-leadership, it starts way before someone gives you a title, way before. When you are a good self-leader, you are intentionally doing several things. You are intentionally managing your thoughts. You're managing your emotions. You're managing your behaviors. You're managing your reactions. Everything is aligned to your values and your goals. And here's the thing I have found in the 23, 24 years I have been coaching and doing this work, is that very few people that I talk to know what they want. And it sounds silly, because if I say to you, like, hey, what do you want? You know, most people are like, well, that's a simple question to answer. And it's not. Most people go, oh, well, I want to be happy. Well, everybody wants to be happy. But what do you really want? When you get down to it, it is a hard question for people to answer. Secondly, people have not taken the time to identify their values. You know, if you work in an organization, all organizations have core values, things like honesty, integrity. Take some time to do that for yourself, because very few people know what their values are. And attached to values are goals. You know, we set goals at work, but I would love to see everybody set personal goals as well. I mean, I take the time between Christmas and New Year's, that week that usually falls in between. And that is when I actually set my goals and intentions for the following year, because it's intentional. And so that's the word I want you to remember as we talk about self-leadership today, because everything with self-leadership is intentionally influencing all of these things that we talked about. And it's being driven by your values and the goals and the type of person that you want to be. All right. So questions you ask yourself when you are in this journey of self-leadership is, you know, who am I becoming? You know, regardless of how old you are becoming someone. I don't care if you are 55 like I am, if you're 75, if you're 22. All right. Who are you becoming? Who do you want to become? Are you living intentionally, or are you just reacting to life? Because one of the reasons I can tell you I started this podcast is because all of the travel I do, all of the people I work with, I see people rushing around, living their lives through their phone, and nobody is intentionally slowing down and actually taking the time to think about, hey, what's my next step? I'm not going to react here. I would rather respond. What's the best response or behavior for this situation? I see very little of that, and I'm hoping that this podcast and these episodes that I do, and that you're sharing this everywhere, starts a global awareness about slowing down and being very, very intentional of what you want in your life and what you want to bring into your life, okay? The other question that I want you to think about asking yourself is, am I acting consistently with what matters most to me, with what's important? You know, there's honesty and there's integrity. Honesty is what you do, honesty is what you say, integrity is what you do. And those need to match up. a lot of the times we're really honest when we say something. If I say to you, yes, I'm going to be at your house at 9 o'clock, but I show up at 9:15, well, now my word is shit, right? Because I did not match my intentions to my word. And I want you to practice doing that in your life. I want you to practice looking at what your intentions are and do your behaviors match that. So if I were a fly and I followed you around all day, would I be able to identify what's most important to you by watching you? And that's important. And so self-leadership is about practicing what you preach. And I can tell you from the years of work I've done with people, you know, when you coach and when you do a podcast and when you speak in front of people, the thing that I will tell you is that you are transparent. People see right through you. If I am talking about balance and I am not balanced myself, people see right through that. And it might not even be anything I say. I could say all the perfect things, but you can feel it. We're energy beings. So you can feel that, hey, something's off about what Chris is saying. So you have to be on. To be a good self-leader, you have to be on because people see right through you, all right? People, remember, don't follow your words. They follow your actions. And so to be a good self-leader, you have to have the right actions. So, for example, if I am telling you to stay calm, but I am constantly stressed out and you have never seen me calm, you're going to say Chris doesn't know what she's talking about. If I expect you to be honest, but I'm not honest, or I'm even not honest with myself, that also is a misalignment as well. People notice these things all of the time. The greatest leaders model the behavior they expect because people listen with their eyes more than they do with their ears. We watch each other. You know, if you have kids, kids watch you. They mimic you. They mirror you. They see what you do, and whatever you do, they think that must be okay because mom and dad does it, or that must be okay because my leader is doing it. Okay? And this is work and home, both spheres here. So one of the things that I usually tell my leaders to ask themselves is, what kind of leader would people become if they copied everything I did? If they watched me and copied everything I did, what kind of leader would they become? And would they become the kind of leader I want them to become? And that is a really powerful question. The other thing I want you to think about when we talk about self-leadership, and this is in general for just life in general, is the idea of reacting versus responding. We spend a lot of our life in reaction mode, all right? Reaction comes from the habits of the subconscious mind. You know, our subconscious mind creates habits to save energy, and that helps us with a lot of things. But what ends up happening is we end up building all of these reactions and all of these habits, and then we lose our consciousness in our whole life. We lose that intentional piece in our whole life. Part of why we do that is because we don't slow down and pause. Because the difference between reaction and response is a pause. So if my first reaction, if you say something to me and my first reaction is I get angry, like that is a habit of mine to get angry and yell. And I don't want to do that anymore. What I have to do is I have to first be really self-aware that, wow, that feeling just came up and I'm angry and I want to yell. And then I pause for a second. I take a deep breath. And then in that pause is where choice lives. That is where you can then make a choice to respond differently. All right, instead of yelling and getting angry, I'm going to take a breath, lower my tone, and ask a question, whatever that might be. But that is the difference between reaction and response. And let's face it, we react all day long. All right, we get triggered all day long. You get an email, you react to it, a text message, difficult coworkers. We respond and react to traffic, to social media. The news is crazy right now, so we react to the news. And our reactions, again, are habit. And instead of doing that, instead of allowing that automatic response to kick in And when that happens, you're usually going, what the heck? What the heck is happening here? And you feel as if you have no control. I want you to step back and ask yourself, how do I want to respond? What feels better? Because usually when we react, it's not from a positive, good feeling. It's usually from a negative feeling, and it usually creates a negative feeling. I want you to ask yourself, how do I want to respond? How do I want to feel after this? A better way to ask that, and I do this a lot myself, this is one of the things I have to practice multiple times a day, is asking myself when I'm caught in a situation where I feel overwhelmed, maybe something is on my mind and I'm worried a lot about it, maybe something suddenly changes and there's a big unknown. I have to pause and I have to ask myself, what is in my control? What is in my control? Because in any situation, you have, and I usually draw circles to show this, but you have what's in your control, you have the things you can influence, and then you have the things that are completely out of bound. And 80% of the time, our energy is going to worrying about things that are out of bound. But you can intentionally make the choice to shift your mindset and ask yourself, what is in my control here? How do I want to respond? So I'm going to give you an example of this that literally just happened last week to me. So I have a 13-year-old grandson, and him and I go on a trip every year. He's been hard to buy for. I had girls, and he's a boy, and I felt like I was buying him all these knickknacks, and they were sitting on a shelf. So I finally said to him, we're going to go on a trip every year. So we decided this year to take a road trip up the Pacific Northwest. So we started in Sacramento. We drove up to Mount Shasta, which is my favorite place. That's what's tattooed on my arm here. Portland, Oregon. We drove up to Olympia, Washington to see Mount Rainier. Great trip. Well, my grandson has epilepsy, and it's not a bad kind of epilepsy. It's actually the kind you get in adolescence, and it's actually starting to get better for him. And he hasn't had a seizure in a while. And we were in the car, and thank God, I was 15 minutes from the hotel, and we are driving to Washington, and he has a seizure in the backseat of the car last week. And sometimes things trigger immediate reaction mode. Like I physically started shaking. I had to try to open his medicine, and I can't even get it open because I'm shaking. And I had to really quickly, if you listen to my last episode, I think it was episode 3 with Joe White, we talked about managing your emotional state. I had to really quickly rein it in and go from reaction to response because, one, I wanted him to be taken care of. I had to pull off on the side of the road on a freeway. So I had some decisions to make, and I needed a good emotional state and a solid mind to do that. So I had to pause. All right. And pausing when someone you dearly love is in the backseat having a seizure is not an easy thing. But I had to give myself a pause. I had to take a breath. And that made all of the difference. I was able to think a little bit more clearly, pulled off to the side of the road. But I also had to manage my reaction versus response the rest of the trip. Because, of course, as Mimi here, I was worried the rest of the trip about him, about what if we have another seizure everywhere we went. I was worried about it. And so my reaction was I wanted to hover. I wanted to check on him constantly. And so I had to take a pause and I had to step back and I had to go, okay, if I were him, a 13-year-old, what would I want? What's going to make him feel secure? What's going to make him feel safe? So I had to really check myself. And that is a big difference between reaction and response because I had to choose response over my reaction. All right. And Joe White said when he was on the podcast a couple episodes ago, he made a comment that emotions sometimes lie. And that's true, especially when you feel fear. Fear tells you can't do something, and that's a lie. And that is where when you take a second to kind of reframe things and pause and say, what do I want? How do I want to respond here? That makes all of the difference. The first thing that has to happen, though, is you have to be self-aware, and that is really the foundation of all of this is self-awareness. You have to be self-aware, and that is the foundation really of everything, of emotional intelligence, of any development work you want to do. You have to know your strengths. You have to know your blind spots. You have to know what your triggers are. Your triggers might change in different situations with different people. You have to know what your habits are. You have to know how you experience people around you. And again, that changes based on the person. Many formal leaders spend years learning to lead other people. You know, they take the classes, they develop the skills, but very few of them stop to actually understand themselves. That is why emotional intelligence is so important in leadership, okay? Influence and being able to influence is one of the characteristics of a very strong leader. And when your influence grows, it grows because your authenticity grows. And you become authentic, the more self-aware you are and the better you're leading yourself. And that is in your personal life and professional life as well. People trust leaders and they trust people who know themselves. You know, you've probably met people in your life that you just automatically trust, you automatically like, and there's something about them that attracts you to them because you're like, they've got something figured out. I don't know what it is, but it just feels like they've got it figured out. I guarantee you that person has spent time on themselves. They know what they want. They align their actions and their behaviors and their values towards what they want, and nothing gets in their way. That is self-awareness, and that is self-leadership. I often ask myself a couple questions, and this question I asked myself for a while leads me to my next point. But I used to ask myself all of the time, I wonder what it's like being on the other side of me. You know, because we don't get that experience. We hear our own voice in our head, which sounds a specific way to us, might sound different to other people. Trust me, when I listen to my podcast and I hear my voice, I'm like, oh my God, that is what people hear. But I'm sure you don't hear what I hear. But we experience ourselves very differently. And I often wondered, I'm like, you know, what is it like being on that side of me? Like, you know, listening to me, feeling my energy, what is it like? And that led me to this concept, and I wrote a blog about it a few years ago called The Leadership Energy Footprint. And what a leadership energy footprint is a couple things, but the main thing is an awareness of how do I want someone to feel? What footprint do I want to leave with someone after I interact with them? All right. And it includes yourself as well. You know, what footprint do I want to leave with myself? But when you think about what is my leadership energy footprint, and you can identify it, like, so for me, I want to be genuine, authentic. I want to leave people with this sense of inspiration that, you know, I can do it regardless, even if it's a high as I walk past someone in New York City, you know, on the sidewalk. What do you want to leave people with? What footprint? And when you start asking yourselves those questions, how do you want them to feel? How do you want them to respond to you? That's very intentional. And that takes you to the point where you've got to slow down and you've got to think about your response more, because reaction doesn't always do it. Now, I'm not saying that all reaction is bad. All right. Reaction sometimes is a good thing. And it's part of our responses to fear and protection. But in day-to-day life, as you develop yourself and as you grow, you need more pausing and more slowing down in order to figure out, how do I want to respond here? All right. Because remember, you can't control other people. You can only control what is in that realm that we talked about, like what you can control. And when you ask yourself that question, what can I control? What can I control here? That is really the key, because then that takes all of this energy that's scattered out here, brings it back in to you focusing on those things that matter, that you've identified, okay? So I want to bring this for full circle, because if you've listened to my podcast and you listened to, I think it was episode 1 or 2, where I told my story of when I got really bad colitis, you know, talk about running at full speed. Because, you know, if you remember, I was working, I was going to graduate school, I was raising 2 daughters. My idea of success was doing more. You know, if I go faster and I do more, I'm going to be successful. I'm going to get everything I want, until my body completely forced me to stop. All right, I got really sick, because remember, we talked about that 2x4 moment. And I realized that I had spent so many years managing my schedule, worrying about what other people thought about me, living in alignment with other people's expectations and not my own, that I really wasn't leading myself. I was allowing life and my circumstances to guide me and to lead me. And so many of us folks do that. We do it all of the time. You let Instagram and the number of followers lead you. I'm going to do this because I want this. And that's very different than doing something because you're focused on a goal. All right. Everything has to be intentional. And one of the things that I realized was that when I was making decisions, when I was, not leading myself well, I was not even in the equation of my decisions. I wasn't even putting myself in there. It was everything else. What's best for my kids, what's best for my husband, what's best for everybody, what's going to make people like me, whatever it was, that's what I was using as a template to make all of my decisions. And it wasn't until I finally put myself in the equation. Like, I do matter. I value. What do I want? And it's okay to want what I want. That was when I was actually starting to lead myself. And that was a huge, huge pivot for me, because that's when I really started to identify what are my values, what are the things I want. Okay. So some practical tips for you. We could talk about this topic all day long, but here's some things that I want you to start doing. And I want you to you can just pick one of these if you want. You can do all three, but just pick one of them and start small. I want you to start your morning before you look at your phone. Okay, do not have your alarm go off and the very first thing you do is grab your phone. If you need to turn off your alarm because it's on your phone, that's fine. But I want you to spend a few minutes in the morning thinking about, what kind of day do I want today to be? How do I want to feel today? What matters most to me today? What is the outcome I'm looking for today? And really be intentional with that. I do that every morning. I get up, I'm a morning person. So, I get up 2 hours before I have to start my day. And I either do some silent reading, I either do meditating. I have a book where I keep, affirmations and mantras. Sometimes I read that. It just depends on how I feel in the morning. But I always spend some time with myself before I look at my phone. All right, because that sends you into a different energy the minute you pick up your phone and you start scrolling on social media. So that's number one. Number two, I want you to notice one reoccurring reaction or one trigger that you have. All right. And I want you to ask yourself a few questions. So maybe it's you notice you respond a certain way to a coworker or your spouse. I want you to ask yourself, what triggered me? What story did I tell myself? So what part of what I'm thinking is story and what part is fact? All right. And what would a better response look like? What would I rather respond like? All right. Think about your leadership energy footprint we talked about. And then the third one is to keep a promise to yourself. So maybe you decided, hey, I'm going to exercise once a week. Maybe you decided I'm going to drink more water. Maybe I'm going to go to bed, at 10 o'clock every night and on time. Whatever it is, keep the promise to yourself, because every time you break a promise to yourself, it's like you're nicking away at your self-worth and self-esteem, because what you're telling yourself is you don't matter, you don't value for me to keep my word to you. All right. And I want you to start paying attention to that, paying attention to your word and keeping your word to yourself as much as you do with other people. Okay. So as always, we're going to end this podcast with our pause with purpose moment. And our pause with purpose moment is where I kind of give you a quote. I give you kind of a reflection to think about. I gave you some practical tips. But what I want to end with today, I'm going to give you the quote first, because I love this quote. And the quote is, self-leadership isn't about being perfect. It's about being intentional. Every day, you either lead your habits, your mindset, or your choices, or they lead you. Super powerful. It's all about mindset. And so what I want you to do this week is I just want you to choose one habit that you have, all right? And I want you to take that habit and I want you to just break it apart. I want you to look at it and say, is this a good habit? Is this in alignment with my values? Is this in alignment with what I want and the type of person I want to be? And break it apart Ask yourself, what can I control? Change what you need to change and align it with your values and who you want to become, okay? That and the practical tips will give you enough homework until we meet next week. So for now, we are going to close out here. I thank you so much for listening today. Please remember, whatever podcast platform you listen on, make sure you follow us. Subscribe to the YouTube channel if you want to see this live. You want to see what I'm wearing or whatever, watch it on YouTube. Sometimes it's fun. I do that, but it's not my favorite thing, but I like to listen. So make sure you follow us, subscribe. We've got an Instagram page as well, the intentionalpausepodcast.com. Make sure you do that. And again, I so appreciate you listening. Please share this with others that you think may benefit from this topic, because I really do want to start a global conversation around people just intentionally pausing and slowing down. So again, thanks for being here today, and I'll see you next time. Thanks so much for joining me for this episode of The Intentional Pause. My hope is that something you heard today really encourages you and helps you slow down, reflect, and make space for what matters most. If you enjoyed this conversation, which I know I did, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share this with somebody who could use an intentional pause in their life or who could relate to the story. If you have a story you want to share or a question, please leave a comment. And if you want to talk to me about leadership development programs for your organization, some executive coaching maybe, or a keynote for an event, my contact info is in the show notes. I'm your host, Dr. Chris Sopa, and until next time, take care of yourself, trust the process, and remember, slowing down is not a weakness. It's where the power lies.